Is there anything else that you want to point out on this particular sheet?
Before we leave this, as we mentioned, when we as we started it with the introduction, we're going to build this webinar and this conversation that we're having, our fireside conversation on financials around, our good friend Norton Henley. He had written the book on getting down to business. One of the things that Norton routinely discussed in the book, and where Rachel and I do spend a lot of our time, are those two concepts of return to labor and return to capital. And so when Cheryl pointed out to the operating income of 436,000, that is the number we kind of begin with, from which the owner in this case has an amount of that 436 coming back to them as a return to labor. In other words, compensation for the work they do, generating that top line revenue. And that's where this gets a little arbitrary. What is that right return to labor? But whatever that number is, Josh, you kind of identified as like, gee whiz, there's 430. We start at the top line with 882, but we end with 120. But between that 882 and that 120, we have those operating expenses. We have a return to labor charge to compensate the doc for their services. And then that very bottom line, that 120,000, arguably is the return to capital. In other words, their return on investment. And when we do the valuations, and we'll get into that way more next month, that return to labor is an important number. That return to capital is a very important number, because at the very beginning of time for a dental practice owner, most of that return to capital is likely going to cover debt service. In this particular practice, we know that there's very little debt, so that $120,000 is typically going to the doctor's pocket at home as a draw out of the practice. But I wanted to make sure we started at least pointing that out, because when we do get further into the valuation work, and we do principally look at the income statements to help us do those valuations, we stand fast to those two very important terms: return to labor, which is the owner compensation, and then return to capital, which is the return on investment.
Return to labor being the owner compensation in the scenario where there's an owner operator. If the owner were not the dentist, return to labor would be what you pay the dentist that runs the practice, even if they're not an owner.
That's correct. That's correct.
So in this example, or for an example, then let's just say it was, if someone else was the owner operator, would that mean, they paid the salary to the doctor, the 190? Does the owner operator get the 120? Does he get the return to capital?
The owner would. That's correct. And in this particular example, if we wanted to go down that path, we would have to ask the question whether or not $190,000 is a reasonable compensation for a doctor who is not an owner but working in the practice. But yes, Josh, to answer your question simply, if I were to own this and I'm not a dentist and I paid out everything according to this, then arguably speaking, at the end of 9 months, I would have a profit of $120,000 for me. Now, if I had debt to buy the practice, that 120,000 may come down further by that debt. But if I paid cash for the practice, that 120,000 comes back to me.
That makes sense.
Which brings you back into like the cash flow statement, which
I just wanted to be clear the difference between return to labor being an owner operator and a non-owner dentist. It's either going to be above in operating expenses, right, or if you are an owner operator, then your income is discretionary and is then below the line. But if you're an owner and you're not a dentist, then you absolutely have to pay a dentist to run your practice. And now the compensation to a non-owner dentist is going to be above the line.
Yeah, it's going to be salaries up in that 14.
We call above the line, meaning above the non-operating expense line. So yes, the compensation to a non-owner dentist being required to run your practice is going to be in the operating expense line.
Mhm.
That's a very good point.
Yeah, so the
And-
214 up above would be more like 350.
That's right. Yeah. And I like the presentation this way because it gets to tell the story a little bit more with the doc, and you know, he or she should ask, how am I doing this year? And I like the presentation this way because the last column tells us the story year over year. Business is up, right? We look at the top line year over year, collection income is up 13.6% or $105,000. That is a nice increase, you know, and we can have lots of conversations about why that's happening. And as we scroll down, it's very interesting in this particular example, almost, well, not almost, all of that falls to the profit line, the operating income line, the net margin before owner compensation. So this is very bizarre if this is an actual, and this is
Right, because you're essentially, what essentially the story is, I've made an additional 105 grand in revenue with no additional expenses, which is
Yeah.
really impossible.
Which has been very
and quite frankly, there is an increase in those other, you can see there is an increase in cost of goods sold. There is an increase in salary and benefits line. However, there's a significant decrease in the administrative expenses.
Yeah, they
So
dropped
that
advertising.
offsets it, you know, and this may be the case where they may have been using a consultant for years, and those consulting expenses are now winding off the income statement because that engagement no longer has expired, but the doc is now benefiting from all they learned from that consultant, and now voila, I am making more money. I am now getting to keep more of that, and at the same time, I'm now no longer having to pay that consultant, so more of that money gets to come to my bottom line. That could be the story here. I don't remember the specifics of this particular client, but that's generally what's going to happen here. There may have been other reasons why those other expenses were much higher and now are significantly lower. But this is a nice story to share with the doc. Hey, you're doing more, and now as we go to the very bottom line, you're keeping more of that as well. So, you know, so good for you. You've really improved the profitability of the practice. And you can see that throughout. And as we go back and we can, you know, as we summarize with the cash flow statement next week, we can always go back and show, yeah, and all this means there was more cash in the bank for you from which you can do other things with.
Yeah.
But
Well,
this
the other
is kind
thing,
of
the other thing,
my most favorite. Go ahead, Cheryl.